The stone is cold in the mason's hands. November 1277. Rain hammers the scaffold. Below, mud churns where English soldiers patrol the perimeter. Above, the tower climbs another course. This is Rhuddlan Castle, one of 10 fortresses King Edward I is raising across Wales, not to defend England, to crush Wales. The mason is Welsh. His grandfather fought the English and lost. His father paid taxes to English lords and died poor. Now he cuts stone for the castle that will ensure his children never know freedom. The irony is not lost on him, but the wage is steady. Starvation is certain. 200 miles away, another castle rises, and another, and another. By the time Edward is done, Wales will have more castles per square mile than anywhere on earth. Tourists today call them beautiful. UNESCO calls them World Heritage Sites. The Welsh called them something else: prisons, monuments to occupation, stone proof that their country had been stolen. This is not a fairy tale. This is the dark story of why Wales has more castles than anywhere on earth. And the truth is not romantic. Stand anywhere in Wales and you are probably within sight of a castle. Over 600 of them, more than any other country on the planet relative to its size. Some are crumbling ruins on hilltops. Others are intact fortresses with walls 30 feet thick. Tourists flock to them. Photographers frame them against sunsets. They appear on postcards and travel blogs as symbols of medieval romance. But these castles were never romantic. They were weapons, tools of conquest, instruments of a systematic military occupation that lasted centuries and reshaped an entire nation. The story begins in 1277 when King Edward I of England invaded Wales with one clear objective: total subjugation. What followed was one of the most sophisticated military campaigns of the Middle Ages. Edward did not just defeat the Welsh in battle. He built a network of fortresses so comprehensive, so strategically placed, so overwhelmingly powerful that resistance became nearly impossible. These castles were not defensive structures built by Welsh rulers to protect their people. They were offensive weapons built by English kings to control a conquered population. They were symbols of domination, garrisons for occupying troops, administrative centers for extracting wealth, and architectural proof that Wales no longer belonged to the Welsh. The scale was staggering, the cost was astronomical, the labor force was coerced. And the result was a landscape permanently marked by stone reminders of foreign rule. This is the story of those castles, but it is also the story of the people who built them under duress, the communities they displaced, the culture they helped suppress, and the nation that still lives in their shadow. This is the story of how architecture becomes violence, how beauty can be built on brutality, and how monuments to power always carry darker truths beneath their tourist-friendly surfaces. This is the dark story of why Wales has more castles than anywhere on earth. Edward I of England was not a romantic. He was a calculator. Born in 1239, trained in warfare from childhood, he ascended to the throne in 1272 with a reputation for ruthlessness and strategic brilliance. He had crushed rebellions in England. He had fought in the Crusades. He understood power, and he understood that power, to last, had to be made visible, permanent, undeniable. Wales was his obsession. For generations, Welsh princes had resisted English rule. The mountainous terrain favored guerrilla warfare. English armies could win battles but could not hold ground. Castles existed in Wales before Edward arrived. Norman lords had built some, Welsh princes had built others, but they were scattered, inconsistent, insufficient. Edward saw the problem clearly. To control Wales, he needed to rewrite the landscape itself. His solution was unprecedented. He would build a network of fortresses so powerful, so strategically interconnected, that Welsh resistance would become logistically impossible. These would not be simple defensive structures. They would be statements, messages carved in limestone and sandstone. This land is ours now, forever. The conquest began in 1277. Edward's army was massive by medieval standards, 15,000 men, a staggering logistical undertaking. But the real invasion force came behind the soldiers: masons, carpenters, quarrymen, engineers. Master James of St. George arrived from Savoy, one of the most celebrated military architects in Europe. Edward had seen his work in the Alpine fortresses and recruited him immediately. James would become the creative genius behind Edward's vision, but the vision itself was purely the king's and architectural occupation. The castles rose in waves, Flint and Rhuddlan first, controlling the northern coast. Then, after the Welsh uprising of 1282 led by Llewellyn ap Gruffudd, the last native prince of Wales, was brutally suppressed, Edward unleashed construction on an almost unimaginable scale. Conwy, Harlech, Caernarfon, Beaumaris. Each castle was positioned to control key territories, river crossings, coastal harbours, mountain passes. Each could be resupplied by sea, immune to siege. Each was linked by newly constructed roads that English soldiers could march along without fear of ambush. The design philosophy was revolutionary. Concentric walls, one defensive ring inside another, meant that even if attackers breached the outer fortifications, they would face a second, equally deadly barrier. Towers jutted at angles calculated to eliminate blind spots, allowing archers overlapping fields of fire. Murder holes above gateways could pour boiling water or stones onto invaders. The scale was intimidating. Caernarfon's walls stretched nearly half a mile in circumference. Conwy had 21 towers and a town wall enclosing 30 acres. These were not just military installations, they were colonial infrastructure, and they were expensive, catastrophically so. Edward spent more than £80,000 zonno on his Welsh castles, equivalent to roughly £100 million today, an amount that nearly bankrupted the English crown. He taxed his nobility to the breaking point. He borrowed from Italian bankers. He requisitioned labour from across England, thousands of workers, some coerced, many paid wages but essentially conscripted for years at a time. Records from Beaumaris show 400 masons, 2,000 labourers, 200 quarrymen working simultaneously at the peak of construction in 1295. Men died in accidents, from disease, from exhaustion, but Edward got what he paid for. By 1300, Wales had been transformed. The castles stood, a permanent occupation force rendered in stone. Welsh uprisings continued briefly, futilely. Edward's fortresses made rebellion unwinnable. He had not merely conquered Wales, he had colonized its geography, turned the land itself into an instrument of control. The Welsh could live in their villages, speak their language, remember their princes. But when they looked up at the towers looming over their market squares, they knew exactly who ruled them now. The plan was called the Iron Ring. 8 major castles built in a carefully coordinated arc across North Wales: Flint, Rhuddlan, Conwy, Caernarfon, Harlech, Beaumaris, Criccieth, and Aberystwyth, each positioned to control key river crossings, coastal access points, and mountain passes, each within sight or signaling distance of the next, each designed to function as both a fortress and economic stranglehold. This was not random castle building. This was military architecture as systematic conquest. Edward hired the best. Master James of St. George, a French engineer with a reputation for impregnable fortifications, designed most of the major structures. He had built castles in Savoy. He understood concentric walls, murder holes, arrow slits angled for maximum killing efficiency. He knew how to turn stone into an unbreakable cage. Construction began in 1277, immediately after Edward's first Welsh campaign. The timeline was brutal. Caernarfon, the symbolic heart of Edward's occupation, took 47 years to complete. Conwy rose in just 4 years, employing 1,500 labourers at its peak. Beaumaris, started in 1295, was so ambitious it was never fully finished, despite decades of work and a budget that nearly bankrupted the English treasury. The logistics were staggering. Stone had to be quarried locally: limestone, sandstone, slate, then shaped by master masons who could read architectural plans and execute precision joinery. Timber came from English forests, floated by ship to Welsh harbours. Iron for gates, hinges, portcullises arrived from forges across England. Lead for roofing was mined, smelted, and transported in sheets. Everything moved by sea because the Welsh countryside was still hostile, the roads barely passable, ambush a constant threat. The workforce was an empire in miniature, a hierarchy of skill and exploitation. At the top, Master James himself, earning 3 shillings a day, more than a common labourer made in 2 weeks. Below him, master masons at 18 pence daily, men who could carve decorative stonework and calculate the physics of arches. Then the skilled tradesmen carpenters, blacksmiths, plasterers earning between 6 pence and a shilling. At the bottom, the diggers, the haulers, the expendable men who broke rock and carried it up scaffolding for 3 pence a day. Many were English, recruited or pressed into service. Some were Welsh, working under armed supervision, building the instruments of their own subjugation. The castles were connected by more than proximity. Edward constructed new roads, fortified supply routes that allowed rapid troop movement between garrisons. He established English boroughs-walled towns adjacent to each castle, where English merchants and settlers received legal privileges denied to the Welsh. In Conwy, Welsh people were forbidden from trading within the town walls after dark. In Caernarfon, Welsh residents needed special permission to enter the fortified borough. The castles were nodes in a network of apartheid, and they were built to be resupplied by sea, a crucial innovation. Harloch's Watergate allowed ships to dock directly beneath the castle walls, even though the sea has since receded and left the fortress landlocked. Beaumaris was positioned on Anglesey with direct tidal access. Conwy sat at a river estuary where supply vessels could navigate inland. This meant that even if Welsh forces surrounded a castle, cut it off from the countryside, the English garrison inside could be fed, armed, and reinforced indefinitely from the coast. Siege warfare became pointless. Starvation tactics wouldn't work. The castles were islands of English power, connected to an empire that could sustain them forever. Master James understood what he was building. In letters to Edward's exchequer, he didn't romanticize the project. He complained about funding delays, labor shortages, the impossible pace Edward demanded. But he never questioned the purpose. He was constructing the architecture of permanent occupation, and he knew it. Each tower he raised, each gatehouse he designed with overlapping fields of fire, each concentric wall that forced attackers into killing zones. These were instruments of colonial control, and they worked exactly as intended. By 1300, the Iron Ring was effectively complete. The Welsh could no longer fight a territorial war. They had lost not just battles, but geography itself. The financial scale was staggering. By conservative estimates, Edward spent over £80,000 ZAR on his Welsh castles between 1277 and 1304. In today's currency, adjusted for labour costs and materials, that translates to roughly £400 million, well over $500 million. Some historians place the real figure even higher when accounting for ongoing maintenance, garrison wages, and supply lines. This was more than England's annual royal revenue in some years. To fund it, Edward squeezed every available source. He taxed his barons. He extracted loans from Italian banking houses. He imposed levies on wool exports, England's primary commodity. He debased the currency. He demanded contributions from the church. The construction of the Welsh castles became a national financial burden that England carried for decades. Where did the money go? Into stone, into timber imported from Ireland and Chester, into iron for gates and hinges, into lead for roofs, into lime for mortar, into feeding and housing the army of labourers required to move millions of tons of material across difficult terrain, and into the salaries of Master James and his cadre of engineers, masons and overseers who commanded the operation with military precision. The records are remarkably detailed. Royal accounts survive, meticulous ledgers tracking every expenditure. Caernarfon alone consumed £27,000 over its construction period, more than a third of the total castle budget. Beaumaris, that perfect geometrical fortress that was never finished, ate through £15,000 before funding finally dried up in 1330. Conwy, built at breakneck speed, cost £15,000 in just 4 years. Harloch, perched dramatically on its crag with a sheer drop to the sea, required £190. Even the smaller fortifications Flint, Rhuddlan, built demanded thousands of pounds each. The expenditure wasn't just construction. Garrisons had to be paid year after year. A constable the castle commander earned £40 annually, a fortune for the era. Knights in service received wages, food allowances, bonuses for hazardous duty. Archers, crossbowmen, men-at-arms all drew regular pay. Supplies had to be shipped constantly: grain, salted meat, wine for officers, ale for soldiers, arrows by the thousands, replacement weapons, clothing, firewood. A castle wasn't just built, it had to be fed perpetually, or it became an empty shell. Edward's financing methods grew increasingly desperate. In 1294, facing another Welsh uprising led by Madog ap Llewellyn, he needed immediate funds for both military campaigns and accelerated construction. He seized wool stocks from merchants without compensation, promising future payment that often never came. He demanded a feudal aid, a tax supposedly voluntary but functionally mandatory from his nobility. When the church resisted his demands for clerical taxation, Edward threatened to withdraw royal protection from church lands, essentially inviting banditry until the bishops capitulated. The Italian banking families, the Riccardi of Lucca initially, then the Frescobaldi of Florence, extended massive credit. They financed construction in exchange for future customs revenues, a gamble that Edward's kingdom could generate enough wealth to repay them. Some won that bet, others didn't. When Edward defaulted on portions of his debt, as he periodically did, banking houses collapsed. Fortunes built over generations evaporated. The economic shockwaves rippled across Europe. English barons began to chafe under the burden. The costs of the Welsh conquest, combined with Edward's expensive wars in Scotland and Gascony, pushed the nobility toward rebellion. In 1297, several major lords refused further taxation, nearly triggering civil war. Edward backed down, conceding limits on his taxing authority, a precursor to the constitutional conflicts that would define English politics for centuries. The irony was brutal. Edward was bleeding England economically to impose his will on Wales militarily. The castles succeeded as instruments of conquest, but they hollowed out the treasury that sustained them. Wales was controlled, pacified, occupied, but the financial cost ensured that England itself was weakened, its resources drained, its political stability compromised. The Iron Ring held Wales in chains, but those chains were forged from English silver, and the weight of them nearly broke the kingdom that wielded them. The irony was bitter and inescapable. The castles built to subjugate Wales were built largely by Welsh hands. Edward's workforce was massive, diverse, and overwhelmingly coerced. At the height of construction, thousands of labourers moved across North Wales under English supervision. Masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, quarrymen, carters, ditchers, each recruited, pressed, or forced into service. English administrative records reveal the system. Sheriffs in English border counties were ordered to recruit skilled workers and send them to Wales under guard. Wages were promised, though payment was often delayed or reduced. Skilled masons came from England, but the bulk of unskilled labour digging foundations, hauling stone, clearing sites was drawn from the local Welsh population. For Welsh labourers, the choice was stark: work for the occupiers or starve. The English had disrupted traditional Welsh agriculture, seized fertile lowlands, and imposed new economic structures that left many communities desperate. A labourer might earn a few pence a day, barely enough to survive, but refusal meant losing access to markets, facing punitive taxes, or being labelled a rebel subject to immediate and violent reprisal. The recruitment records are revealing in their bluntness. In 1283, writs went out across English counties demanding quotas: Cheshire to supply 350 diggers, Shropshire 200 masons, Lincolnshire 120 carpenters. These weren't invitations. Sheriffs had authority to compel attendance, and they used it. Men were rounded up, marched to assembly points, transported under armed escort to construction sites in hostile territory. Some deserted records mention runaways, penalties imposed on communities that failed to deliver their assigned workers. But most stayed, because the alternative was worse. The Welsh who worked on the castles occupied the lowest rungs. They dug ditches in winter mud, They hauled baskets of rubble up wooden scaffolding. They mixed mortar until their hands cracked and bled. They cleared forests, leveled ground, and broke rock in quarries. The skilled positions master mason, chief carpenter, engineer went almost exclusively to English or continental craftsmen. The architectural knowledge, the technical expertise remained firmly in English hands. Welsh workers provided muscle, not mind, and they were built under surveillance. English soldiers patrolled the sites constantly. Construction camps were militarized zones where Welsh laborers worked, ate, and slept under guard. This wasn't just about preventing sabotage, though that was a real concern. It was about maintaining absolute control over a workforce that had every reason to resist. Armed overseers watched the quarries. Sergeants monitored the walls. Any sign of slowed work, any hint of coordinated resistance, brought immediate punishment. The wages themselves were instruments of control. Payment records show systematic manipulation. Workers received partial wages, with the remainder held back as insurance against desertion. Food was sold to laborers at inflated prices by English merchants, ensuring that even paid workers remained dependent. Debt accumulated. Men who arrived free were left trapped in cycles of obligation, unable to return home, unable to quit, functionally bound to the project until it was completed or they died. Deaths were common and rarely recorded by name. Medieval construction was brutally dangerous. Scaffolding collapses, falling stones, crushed limbs, infections from untreated wounds. When Welsh labourers died, they were replaced. The supply seemed endless because the economic coercion was total. English administrators understood they were managing a captive labour force, and they did so with ruthless efficiency. Some Welsh workers may have taken pride in their craftsmanship despite the circumstances. A mason shaping stone, a carpenter fitting timbers, these were skills, and skilled work carries its own satisfaction regardless of the project's purpose. But the final product was unambiguous. When the castles were finished, when the walls stood complete and the gates swung closed, Welsh labourers were expelled from the fortified boroughs they had built. The structures they raised with their own hands became the instruments that policed them, barred them, reminded them daily of their subjugation. This was colonialism's cruelest efficiency, forcing the colonized to construct their own cage, paying them barely enough to survive, then locking them outside the walls and calling it civilization. The Welsh didn't just suffer Edward's conquest. They were made complicit in building its physical architecture, their labour stolen and repurposed as the mortar that held English domination in place. A castle is a machine. Every feature serves a function. The function here was control. Walk through Caernarfon or Conwy and the design speaks clearly. These fortresses were not built to inspire loyalty. They were built to crush hope. The walls at Caernarfon rise 13 feet thick in places. Arrow slits cover every approach, angled to allow defenders to fire while remaining protected. Murder holes in gate passages allowed boiling oil or stones to be dropped on attackers. Towers project outward from the walls, creating overlapping fields of fire so that no dead zones exist where besiegers could gather safely. Inside, the layout is stark. Barracks for English soldiers, armories, storerooms for provisions capable of withstanding months-long sieges, administrative halls where English officials collected taxes, dispensed justice, and enforced laws written in a language most Welsh subjects could not read. The castles were not just military structures. They were the apparatus of the colonial government, condensed into stone. Master James of St. George designed with psychological warfare in mind. The sheer scale intimidated. Caernarfon's polygonal towers and banded masonry deliberately echoed the Theodosian walls of Constantinople. Edward wanted to invoke imperial Rome, to suggest that resistance was futile against a power this ancient and inevitable. The Eagle Tower at Caernarfon rose 70 feet, topped with turrets carved with eagle sculptures, visible for miles. It announced dominance before a word was spoken. The concentric defensive design was revolutionary for its time, but utterly practical in its cruelty. At Beaumaris, the concentric rings created a killing field. If attackers breached the outer wall, already a monumental task, they entered a narrow corridor between walls, where defenders on the inner wall could rain arrows down from protected positions. Any assault became a slaughter. Beaumaris was designed so perfectly for defense that it was never tested in serious combat. Its mere existence deterred attack. The gatehouses were fortresses within fortresses. Conway's twin-towered gates contained portcullises' heavy iron grills that could be dropped to trap attackers between them. Murder holes above allowed defenders to pour projectiles onto anyone caught in this killing zone. The gates opened inward, making them impossible to ram effectively. Every design choice assumed siege, anticipated violence, prepared for the worst. But the castles also functioned as prisons in a more literal sense. Dungeons existed in most of Edward's fortresses. These were not the dramatic torture chambers of Gothic fiction, they were worse. Dark pits carved into bedrock, accessible only through trapdoors where Welsh prisoners awaiting trial or execution were held in conditions that killed slowly through cold, disease, and despair. Records mention prisoners held for months, forgotten, and died without trial. The fortified boroughs adjacent to each castle completed the system of control. English settlers lived inside defensive town walls, protected by the castle garrison. Markets operated under English law. Trade licenses were issued exclusively to English merchants. Welsh people could enter during the day to sell produce or labor, but they were forbidden from residing inside, from owning property, from participating in borough governance. At night, gates closed. The Welsh were locked out of the economic centers built on their own land. This spatial segregation was enforced with meticulous cruelty. In Caernarfon, Welsh residents needed written permission to enter the borough after dark. Violators faced fines, imprisonment, or physical punishment. English law applied inside the walls, Welsh customary law, what remained of it, applied outside. The castle and its borough became islands of English jurisdiction, alien legal territory imposed by force and maintained by the constant threat of violence from the garrison above. The castles also served as surveillance posts. Tower heights weren't accidental, they provided commanding views of the surrounding countryside. English sentries could observe Welsh villages, monitor gatherings, and watch for signs of organization or resistance. Information gathered from these observations informed arrests, preemptive strikes against suspected rebel leaders, collective punishments imposed on communities deemed insufficiently compliant. Edward's fortresses were panopticons before the term existed. They didn't just defend against attacks, they radiated power outward, a constant reminder that the English were watching, that rebellion would be seen before it began, that nowhere in Wales was beyond the reach of English authority. The castles didn't need to fight battles to be effective. Their presence alone was a form of occupation, a permanent siege laid against Welsh autonomy. The stone didn't just keep the English safe, it kept the Welsh afraid. Edward did not just build castles, he built English towns beside them. These were not organic communities. They were planned colonial settlements, deliberately designed to replace Welsh populations with English ones. Caernarfon, Conwy, and Beaumaris each received a royal charter granting special privileges to English settlers while excluding the Welsh. The pattern was consistent, castle completed, walls extended to enclose a planned street grid. English merchants, tradesmen, and their families were given land and tax breaks to relocate. Welsh inhabitants forcibly removed or relegated to unprotected suburbs outside the walls. The result, fortified English enclaves in the heart of Wales, economically and legally separate from the surrounding Welsh countryside. These plantation towns operated under English law. Town charters explicitly barred Welsh people from owning property within the walls, holding office, or trading on equal terms. The castles protected the towns fed the castles, and together they formed nodes of English authority that slowly, relentlessly reshaped the Welsh economy and social structure. The mechanics of colonization were brutally straightforward. When Conway's walls went up in the 1280s, the existing Welsh settlement was demolished, homes razed, families displaced. The site was cleared and replanned according to English urban models, a rectangular grid of streets, Market Square at the center, plots allocated to incoming English settlers. The Charter of 1284, guaranteed these settlers legal privileges that made them a protected class. They could trade freely, bear arms, elect their own officials. The Welsh, even those allowed to enter for commerce, had none of these rights. Caernarfon followed the same template but with even greater ambition. Edward intended it as the symbolic capital of conquered Wales. The town walls stretched over half a mile, punctuated by towers and gates that controlled access. Inside, burgages' town plots with attached houses were distributed to English colonists. The charter was explicit. No Welshman could purchase a burgage, join the merchant guild, or participate in borough government. This wasn't informal discrimination. It was constitutional apartheid, written into the founding documents of the town. The economic implications were devastating for the Welsh. Markets were where wealth circulated, where surplus agricultural produce was sold, where goods were purchased. By confining these markets to English-controlled boroughs and imposing legal restrictions on Welsh participation, Edward strangled Welsh economic independence. Welsh farmers could sell their grain at market, but only to English middlemen who set prices. Welsh craftsmen could work, but not form guilds, not set standards, not control their own trades. The English boroughs became mandatory economic choke points, extracting value from the Welsh countryside while concentrating profit behind walls. The settlers themselves were incentives made flesh. Edward offered tax exemptions, protection, legal advantages, anything to convince English families to move to Wales and hold it demographically. Many came from border counties like Cheshire and Shropshire, though some arrived from as far as London. They were shopkeepers, brewers, bakers, blacksmiths, the artisan and merchant classes looking for opportunity. Edward gave them the opportunity to purchase with Welsh dispossession. Security was paramount. The town walls weren't decorative, they were functional fortifications, built to the same defensive standards as the castles themselves. Conwy's walls still stand largely intact, a near-complete circuit of medieval urban defense. Gates closed at sunset. Welsh visitors were required to leave. English residents slept behind stone barriers patrolled by armed watchmen, a garrison literally next door if trouble erupted. The towns were simultaneously commercial enterprises and military outposts, impossible to separate one function from the other. This plantation strategy had precedence. English kings had used similar methods in Ireland, creating fortified English towns in conquered territories. Edward refined the model, made it systematic, and deployed it across an entire conquered nation. The Welsh could see the future clearly. Their land parcelled out, their economy subordinated, their legal status permanently inferior. The castles might have been the weapon of conquest, but the plantation towns were the instruments of replacement, designed to ensure that even if the garrisons eventually withdrew, English populations would remain, holding the economic and political power, making reconquest impossible. The demographic project failed in the long-term. Wales remained stubbornly Welsh in language and identity. But for generations, these English boroughs functioned exactly as intended. They were islands of colonial authority, legally distinct, economically dominant, militarily protected. They were England recreated in miniature on Welsh soil, sustained by royal decree and defended by Edward's fortresses. The Welsh lived around them, worked for them, traded with them under unequal terms, and watched their own society slowly subordinate to a system designed to erase them. The castles were supposed to make rebellion impossible. For over a century they largely succeeded. But in 1400, a Welsh nobleman named Owain Glyndwr launched the last great Welsh revolt against English rule. For 15 years, Wales burned. Glyndwr was educated, multilingual, and trained in English law. He had served in the English military. He knew the castles intimately, and he understood that they had a weakness. They depended on supply lines, garrison morale, and the willingness of the English crown to keep pouring money into their maintenance. Glyndwr attacked all three. His forces besieged Caernarfon, Harlech, and Aberystwyth. They cut supply routes. They ambushed relief columns. In 1404, Glyndwr captured Harlech Castle and held it for 4 years, using it as his headquarters and the seat of a briefly independent Welsh parliament. For a moment, the Iron Ring broke. But Edward's architecture proved its worth. The castles were too strong to be taken by force without artillery the Welsh lacked. Even when besieged, they could be resupplied by sea. Edward had built them with access to harbours precisely for this reason. By 1415, English forces had recaptured every lost fortress. Glyndwr disappeared into the mountains. The rebellion collapsed. The castles remained. Glyndwr's initial success came from asymmetry. His forces fought as guerrillas, avoiding pitched battles, targeting English garrisons and supply trains with hit-and-run tactics. The Welsh knew the terrain: the mountains, forests, narrow passes where ambush was easy and pursuit dangerous. English columns marching to relieve besieged castles found themselves harassed constantly, losing men to arrows shot from tree lines, supply wagons burned in night raids. Glyndwr exploited exactly what Edward's castles were designed to prevent: Welsh control of the countryside. The capture of Harlech was Glyndwr's greatest triumph and most revealing failure. The castle fell not through assault but through starvation and demoralization. The garrison, undersupplied and aware that no relief was coming, eventually surrendered. Glyndwr held coronation ceremonies there, established a chancery, summoned a parliament with representatives from across Wales. For 4 years, Harlech was the capital of an independent Welsh state, its English-built walls sheltering a Welsh government. But Glyndwr couldn't hold the castle network. He lacked the resources. Edward had commanded the ability to maintain multiple garrisons simultaneously, to resupply them by sea, to rotate troops and prevent desertion. Welsh forces besieged Caernarfon for months but couldn't breach its walls. Conwy was attacked repeatedly and held every time. Beaumaris, though never fully completed, remained impregnable. The castles functioned exactly as Edward intended. Even understaffed, even partially provisioned, they were too strong to fall. The English counteroffensive, when it came, was methodical. Prince Henry, later Henry V, commanded the reconquest. English forces used the castles that remained in their control as staging points, coordinating movements along the roads Edward had built a century earlier. They brought ships, artillery, and professional soldiers. Harlech was besieged in 1408 and starved back into English hands. Aberystwyth followed the next year. Glyndwr's forces melted back into the hills. What doomed the rebellion wasn't just military defeat, it was economic exhaustion. 15 years of warfare devastated Wales. Fields unplanted, villages burned by both sides, trade disrupted, populations displaced. The English boroughs, protected behind their walls, survived relatively intact. The Welsh countryside was ruined. Glyndwr's support eroded not because people stopped believing in independence, but because survival became the only priority. Rebellion required surplus food, surplus manpower, surplus hope. By 1412, Wales had none left. Glyndwr himself vanished. No record marks his death. He refused English pardons, refused to surrender, simply faded into legend. His disappearance became a metaphor. Welsh resistance hadn't been defeated, merely driven underground, waiting. But practically, the rebellion's failure confirmed what Edward's architects had designed a century earlier. The castles worked. Wales could burn, could rise in revolt, could fight with desperate courage, and the fortresses would still stand. They didn't need to defeat every Welsh army. They only needed to endure. The aftermath was predictable. Harsher laws, collective punishments, restrictions on Welsh rights expanded and codified. The English Parliament passed statutes prohibiting Welsh people from holding office, bearing arms within English boroughs, or gathering in groups without permission. Glyndwr's rebellion had proven that Welsh resistance was possible, but it had also proven that Edward's castles made victory impossible. The architecture of conquest had held. Wales remained conquered, and the stone walls that imprisoned it remained unbreached, monuments to the military logic that power, properly built, can outlast any rebellion, any hope, any generation's dreams of freedom. By the 16th century, the castles were obsolete. Gunpowder artillery had rendered medieval walls ineffective. The Tudor dynasty, partly Welsh in origin, reduced the need for military occupation. The fortresses were expensive to maintain and no longer militarily necessary. Slowly, They were abandoned. Roofs collapsed. Wooden structures rotted. Stone was pillaged for local building projects. What had once been instruments of domination became picturesque ruins. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Romantic poets and painters discovered them. They wrote about crumbling towers silhouetted against sunsets, about ivy creeping over ancient stones, about the melancholy beauty of fallen grandeur. This was the moment when the castles began their transformation from weapons to symbols. English travelers admired them as relics of a glorious medieval past. Artists framed them as aesthetic objects. The violence they represented was smoothed over, rewritten, turned into nostalgia. The process of abandonment was gradual and uneven. Some castles, like Caernarfon, retained symbolic importance and received periodic maintenance. Others, like Beaumaris, were simply left to weather and time. By 1600, most had lost their roof sleeves stripped and sold, timbers salvaged for firewood or construction. Without roofs, rainwater poured into interior spaces, accelerating decay. Mortar dissolved, stones shifted. Walls that had withstood siege engines crumbled under the patient assault of frost and vegetation. Local populations treated the ruins pragmatically. Why quarry new stone when thousands of tons sat unused in the castle walls? Records from the 17th century mention stones from Conwy being carted away for house construction, bridge repairs, harbour walls. The same rocks Welsh labourers had hauled up scaffolding centuries earlier were now being reclaimed, repurposed, embedded into the ordinary architecture of Welsh life. There was poetry in this colonialism's monuments literally dismantled and absorbed into the infrastructure of the colonized. But the Romantic movement saw something different. English poets of the late 18th century figures like Thomas Gray and William Wordsworth visited Wales and wrote rapturously about the ruins. Caernarfon became a meditation on the passage of time, on glory faded, on the inevitable decline of even the mightiest works. Painters followed, JMW. Turner produced watercolors of Harlech, dramatic and moody, emphasizing the sublime power of nature reclaiming human ambition. The castles were no longer threats. They were subjects, aesthetic experiences, opportunities for contemplation. This aestheticization erased history. When Turner painted Harlech, he wasn't thinking about the Welsh labourers who built it under coercion, or the families displaced to construct the English borough, or the generations who lived in its shadow as a symbol of subjugation. He saw ruins, stones, light and shadow. The violence was invisible, purged from the frame. What remained was beauty, and beauty implies no guilt. The Victorian era accelerated this transformation. As the British Empire expanded globally, Wales was reframed as a successfully integrated region, a proof of concept for imperial governance. The castles became heritage sites, national treasures, not of Wales, but of Britain. Preservation efforts began, funded by English heritage organizations. Walls were stabilized, vegetation cleared, interpretive plaques installed explaining the architectural significance, the engineering genius, the historical importance. What they rarely explained was the purpose. Systematic colonial domination. Tourism followed. By the late 19th century, rail lines made North Wales accessible to middle-class English vacationers. The castles were marketed as attractions, places to visit, admire, photograph. Guidebooks emphasized their grandeur, their age, their connection to Edward I, portrayed now as a nation-builder, a unifier, a strong king who brought order to chaos. The Welsh perspective, the experience of conquest, was marginalized or ignored entirely. History was being rewritten in real time, not through lies but through selective emphasis, through the quiet erasure of context. Welsh voices complicated this narrative but were often dismissed as parochial or bitter. When Welsh historians pointed out that these castles were instruments of oppression, English audiences responded with confusion or defensiveness. How could something so beautiful, so historically important, be morally tainted? The architecture itself became an argument. Look at the craftsmanship, the engineering, the vision required to build this. Surely that deserves admiration, regardless of intent. This is how occupation becomes history. The weapons rust, the chains corrode, and what remains is stone-neutral, ancient, aesthetically compelling. The violence fades into abstraction. The castles stop being tools and become monuments. Tourists walk through them, marvel at the views, take selfies in archways, and never confront the fact that they're standing inside machines designed to crush a people's autonomy. The ruins are real. The history is real. But the connection between them grows harder to see with every passing generation, every guidebook that describes medieval architecture without saying colonial fortress, every photograph that frames stones against sky without acknowledging what those stones were built to do. Today, Wales's castles are a tourist industry. Caernarfon alone receives over 200,000 visitors annually. Families pose for photos. Tour guides explain architectural features. Gift shops sell miniature swords and dragon keychains. UNESCO designated several of Edward's castles as World Heritage Sites in 1986, praising them as the finest examples of late 13th century and early 14th century military architecture in Europe. The language is telling. Military architecture, not tools of occupation, not monuments to conquest. The framing is technical, aesthetic, detached. It invites admiration for engineering and craftsmanship while quietly erasing the purpose those skills served. Many visitors leave with the impression that these castles are simply part of Wales's heritage, beautiful old structures everyone can celebrate. The history presented is often sanitized, focused on battles and kings, light on the systematic subjugation and cultural suppression the castles enabled. The Welsh voices those who built the castles under duress, those who lived under their shadow, those whose land and language and autonomy were taken are harder to find in the official narratives. Walk through Caernarfon on a summer afternoon and the scene is cheerful, almost festive. Children run across the lawn where Edward's soldiers once mustered. Couples eat ice cream beside walls built to intimidate a conquered population. Audio guides available in multiple languages explain the polygonal towers, the banded stonework inspired by Constantinople, the defensive genius of overlapping arrow slits. What they rarely explain is why such defenses were necessary, not because Wales was inherently violent, but because it was occupied and resisted that occupation for generations. The interpretive materials have improved incrementally. Modern signage at some sites acknowledges the castle's role in conquest. Cadwa, the Welsh Historic Environment Service that manages the castles, has made efforts to include Welsh perspectives in recent years. But the dominant narrative remains architectural and royal. Edward I features prominently his ambition, his military prowess, his vision. Master James of Sant, George is celebrated as a genius of medieval engineering. The skilled craftsmen are occasionally mentioned. The thousands of Welsh labourers who hauled the stones remain mostly anonymous, statistical, footnoted. This reflects a broader tension in heritage tourism. The castles generate significant revenue for Wales, millions of pounds annually, supporting local economies in regions with limited industry. The town of Caernarfon depends on castle tourism. Hotels, restaurants, shops all benefit from the constant flow of visitors, complicating the narrative, emphasizing the castles as instruments of colonial violence, risks alienating tourists who come expecting a pleasant day out, not a moral reckoning with medieval imperialism. There's also the question of ownership, emotional and historical. Modern Welsh identity is complex, layered with centuries of integration into Britain. Many Welsh people feel pride in the castles, not despite their origins, but because they've been absorbed into a broader Welsh story. The castles are there, undeniably, massively, on Welsh soil. They've become landmarks, points of local pride, symbols that appear on tourism materials alongside dragons and daffodils. Rejecting them entirely feels like rejecting part of Wales itself, even if that part was imposed by force. The UNESCO designation accelerated this process of sanitization. World Heritage status is prestigious, attracting international visitors and funding for conservation. But the criteria emphasize outstanding universal value, architectural significance, historical importance, technical achievement. The designation acknowledges the castles as masterpieces of military engineering without dwelling on what that engineering was designed to accomplish. The plaques celebrate Edward's vision without extensively documenting the coercion, displacement, and legal apartheid that vision required. Gift shops crystallize the contradiction. Toy swords and shields for children, decorated with Welsh dragons, books about brave knights and medieval times, postcards showing castles against dramatic skies with no context beyond dates and architectural terms. The merchandise turns conquest into fantasy, violence into play, history into product. Children leave thinking castles are cool, not contemplating that castles are weapons and that someone was on the receiving end. Some Welsh historians and activists have pushed back, calling for more honest interpretation, more explicit acknowledgement of the castle's colonial purpose. There have been exhibitions, publications, educational programs that centre Welsh experiences, but these efforts coexist uneasily with the tourism apparatus, which has economic incentives to keep things accessible, unchallenging, family-friendly. The result is a kind of historical cognitive dissonance. Visitors can spend an entire day exploring Edward's castles, marveling at their scale and preservation, learning about medieval construction techniques, and never fully confront the fact that these structures were built to break a nation's will. The stones tell one story if you know how to read them, a story of occupation, exploitation, systematic cultural suppression. But the plaques tell another story, and most visitors leave having read only the plaques, thinking they've learned history when they've mostly learned architecture, admiring the cage without seeing the bars. But the Welsh remember. For many in Wales, these castles are not neutral heritage sites. They are scars, reminders of centuries when their language was suppressed, their laws ignored, their land occupied by a foreign power that built fortresses to ensure they could never resist. In recent decades, Welsh historians, activists, and communities have pushed for more honest reckonings with this history. Plaques and exhibits now acknowledge the castle's role in conquest. Discussions about what these monuments represent have become more complex, more contested. Some argue they should be preserved as evidence of injustice, teaching tools about colonialism. Others question whether celebrating them as tourist attractions perpetuates the erasure of Welsh suffering. The Welsh language, once banned in schools and courts, has been revived through deliberate cultural effort. Today, Wales is officially bilingual. The castles, ironically, have become sites where that reclaimed identity has performed Welsh language tours, local histories told from Welsh perspectives, a refusal to let the English version of events be the only one that survives. This reclamation is not universal or uncontroversial. Wales is not monolithic. Different communities, different generations hold different relationships to these monuments. In areas where Welsh is the dominant language, where cultural memory of resistance runs deep, the castles are viewed with clear-eyed awareness of their purpose. They're taught to children not as fairy tale fortresses but as instruments of occupation, evidence of what was done to Wales and why it matters that Wales survived. In more anglicized regions, particularly in the south, the relationship is more ambivalent. Generations of integration have blurred the edges of historical grievance. Some see the castles simply as old buildings, architecturally impressive, economically useful. The idea that they should carry moral weight feels distant, academic, imposed by nationalist sentiment they don't necessarily share. This internal division between those who view the castles as wounds and those who view them as assets reflects deeper questions about what Welsh identity means in the 21st century. Educational initiatives have begun shifting the narrative. Welsh schools now teach the castles within the context of colonialism explicitly. Curriculum materials draw parallels to other colonial projects: British forts in India, Spanish missions in the Americas, helping students understand that what happened in Wales was part of a broader pattern of imperial expansion. This is controversial. Critics, often English or Unionist Welsh, accuse this framing of politicizing history, of imposing modern concepts onto medieval contexts where they don't apply. Defenders respond that colonialism is exactly the right word for what Edward did, and that refusing to use it is itself political. a way of protecting English historical narratives from scrutiny. Some Welsh activists have called for more radical interventions. Proposals to add counter-monument statues honouring Welsh resistance, memorials to those who built the castles under duress, installations that visually interrupt the aesthetic admiration tourists bring. A few have suggested renaming the castles, stripping Edward's name from official designations, referring to them instead by Welsh terms that emphasize occupation. These proposals rarely advance beyond debate, facing practical and financial obstacles, but they signal a growing impatience with half measures, with interpretive plaques that acknowledge conquest in a single paragraph, while devoting pages to architectural details. The language revival has been the most successful form of resistance. Welsh is now taught in schools, used in government, spoken by a growing percentage of the population after decades of decline. When tour guides at Caernarfon conduct tours in Welsh, when local children play in the castle grounds, speaking the language Edward's fortresses were built to suppress, it's a quiet but profound victory. The stones couldn't kill the language. The occupation couldn't erase the culture. Wales adapted, survived, and is now reclaiming space within and around the monuments designed to subjugate it. There's also an artistic response. Welsh poets, playwrights, and visual artists have used the castles as subjects, reframing them through Welsh eyes. Plays staged in castle courtyards that dramatize the construction, showing Welsh labourers in chains, English overseers with whips making the invisible visible. Poetry that describes the stones as stolen, as monuments to theft. Photography that captures the castles from angles that emphasize their oppressive scale, their domination of the landscape, their function as prisons rather than palaces. This cultural work matters because it contests the sanitized tourist narrative without requiring permission from heritage bureaucracies or government bodies. Artists and writers can say what official plaques won't. These castles are beautiful, and they are terrible. They are architecturally significant and morally compromised. They are part of Welsh heritage because they were imposed on Wales, not because Wales chose them. The complexity is the point. The refusal to let the stones be neutral is the reclamation. Memory is active work. It requires effort, intentionality, resistance against the erosion of time, and the convenience of simplified stories. The Welsh who remember what these castles represent, who teach their children, who insist on honest history, they are performing a kind of cultural maintenance as deliberate as the conservation work that keeps the stones from crumbling. They are ensuring that when future generations visit these fortresses, they will understand what they're looking at. Not just medieval architecture, but evidence of colonialism, monuments to conquest, scars in stone that Wales has survived and refuses to forget. Wales's castles teach uncomfortable lessons. They show how architecture can be weaponized, how beauty and brutality can coexist in the same structure, how monuments to power always carry costs that fall heaviest on those with the least power. They also reveal how history is narrated. The same stones can be framed as marvels of engineering or as instruments of oppression. Which story gets told, and who tells it, determines whether the castles are celebrated or mourned. For modern viewers, the challenge is to hold both truths at once. Yes, these castles are architecturally remarkable. Master James of St. George was a genius. The logistics of building them were staggering. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and they were tools of conquest. And they caused immense suffering. And their purpose was to break a nation's will. Admitting one does not cancel the other. It makes the history richer, harder, more honest. The castles force confrontation with a question that extends far beyond medieval Wales. What do we do with monuments built by oppressors? This is not an abstract historical debate. It's alive today in discussions about Confederate statues in the American South, colonial architecture in India and Africa, imperial monuments across Europe. The castles offer no easy answers, but they provide a case study in how societies negotiate these questions over centuries. One lesson is that context matters, desperately. A castle with no interpretive materials, no acknowledgement of its purpose, becomes a site of erasure. Tourists admire it, photograph it, leave thinking they've engaged with history when they've only engaged with aesthetics. but a castle with honest signage, with multiple perspectives presented, with Welsh voices centered alongside English ones that becomes something more complex. A monument that teaches rather than conceals, that provokes thought rather than comfortable nostalgia. Another lesson: physical preservation doesn't require moral celebration. Wales can maintain these castles, prevent their collapse, study their construction techniques, and simultaneously acknowledge that they represent systematic colonial violence. Conservation is not endorsement. The stones are evidence. They testify to what happened. Allowing them to crumble would erase that evidence, would make it easier for future generations to deny or downplay the reality of conquest. The castles should stand not as celebrations of Edward's vision, but as witnesses to what that vision cost. The class dynamics embedded in these structures remain relevant. Medieval hierarchies: kings, nobles, skilled craftsmen. Unskilled laborers mirror modern economic stratification. The castle construction involved exploitation of labor, coercion of workers, concentration of wealth, and decision-making power in the hands of a tiny elite. These patterns haven't disappeared. Contemporary megaprojects, stadiums, skyscrapers, infrastructure in authoritarian states still rely on armies of workers whose names will never be recorded, whose contributions will be invisible, whose suffering will be footnoted at best. The castles remind us that this is not new, that exploitation has always been part of how power builds its monuments. The castles also demonstrate how occupying powers justify their actions to themselves. Edward didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as bringing order, good governance, superior legal systems to a backward region. The plantation towns were framed as civilizing missions, opportunities for Welsh people to benefit from English commercial sophistication. This self-justification, this belief that conquest is benevolent, appears in every colonial project. The British in India, the French in Algeria, the Spanish in the Americas all told similar stories about development, progress, and the white man's burden. The Welsh castles strip away the rhetoric and show the mechanism underneath: violence, displacement, legal apartheid, economic exploitation, all dressed up as improvement. There's also a lesson about resistance and survival. Wales did not disappear. The language survived. The culture adapted. Welsh identity persists, vibrant and distinct, despite centuries of systematic attempts to erase it. This matters for other colonized peoples, other marginalized communities. The castles were designed to make resistance impossible, and they failed, not immediately, not completely, but ultimately. Glyndwr's rebellion was defeated, but the spirit that fueled it never died. It went underground, preserved in families, communities, cultural practices, and eventually re-emerged. The castles still stand, but so does Wales. Perhaps the deepest lesson is about complicity and complexity. Welsh laborers built these castles. Some may have resisted, sabotaged, slowed work where they could. Others may have taken pride in their craftsmanship, found satisfaction in difficult work well done, even as they understood what they were building. Humans are complicated. We make compromises, rationalize our choices, survive in systems we don't control and didn't choose. The Welsh workers who built Edward's fortresses weren't traitors, they were people navigating impossible circumstances. Judging them is easy. Understanding them requires empathy. The castles teach that history is never simple, never clean, never comfortable. They demand that we look at beautiful things and ask what they cost. They insist that we acknowledge craftsmanship without excusing cruelty. They show us that stones can be both artifacts and arguments, that architecture is always political, and that the past is never truly past. It's built into the landscape, waiting for those willing to see it clearly. The question these castles pose is not just about Wales. It is about every monument, every grand structure, every piece of heritage built on foundations that someone else paid for. Who decides what gets remembered, what gets celebrated, whose pain gets written out of the guidebook? Wales's castles force the question because the evidence is so clear. The documents survive. The purpose is undeniable. The violence is recorded. There is no way to tour Caernarfon without confronting what it was built to do if you're willing to look. Other places are less honest. Other monuments hide their origins better. But the principle is the same. Beauty built on coercion is still beautiful. It is also still coercion. The two facts live together in the stone. Tourists will keep coming. Photographers will keep framing ruins against sunsets. And that is fine. But anyone who looks at these castles and sees only romance is choosing not to see the whole picture. The castles are still here because they worked. They broke Wales, and Wales remembers. Walk through the Colosseum in Rome, and you're walking through a building constructed by enslaved people where thousands died for entertainment. Visit the pyramids of Giza, monuments to pharaonic power, built through corvée labor that destroyed countless lives. Tour the palaces of Versailles, where aristocratic splendor was extracted from the backs of French peasants taxed into destitution. Stand before the great cathedrals of medieval Europe, architectural wonders funded by indulgences sold to the desperate and poor. Every grand monument carries this shadow. The Welsh castles are unusual only in how clearly the shadow is documented. Modern infrastructure projects echo these patterns. The stadiums built for World Cups and Olympics on the backs of migrant workers in conditions approaching slavery. The gleaming skyscrapers in Gulf cities constructed by laborers whose passports are confiscated, whose movements are controlled, who die in accidents that go underreported. The dams and highways of authoritarian regimes built through forced relocations, environmental destruction, the erasure of communities deemed obstacles to progress. The mechanisms change, the technology advances, but the underlying logic persists. Those with power build monuments to that power, and those without power provide the labor, willingly or otherwise. The Welsh castles serve as a mirror. They reflect back questions societies prefer to avoid. What are we willing to ignore to enjoy beauty? What violence are we comfortable with if it happened long enough ago? At what point does brutality become heritage? When does a tool of oppression transform into a tourist attraction, and what does that transformation cost? These are not rhetorical questions. They have real consequences. When British politicians invoke medieval English kings as symbols of national greatness, they're selectively remembering. When UNESCO celebrates these castles as architectural achievements without equally emphasizing their colonial purpose, it sends a message about what matters: design over displacement, engineering over ethics. When guidebooks describe Edward I as a great nation builder, without extensively discussing what he destroyed to build that nation, they're curating history, choosing comfort over truth. The castles also expose the inadequacy of simple moral frameworks. They cannot be reduced to good or bad. They are complex objects produced by complex circumstances, embodying contradictions that resist easy resolution. Master James of St. George was a brilliant architect and a willing instrument of colonial violence. The Welsh laborers who built the castles were victims of coercion and contributors to their own oppression. Edward I was a ruthless conqueror and an effective administrator who created legal and governmental structures that lasted centuries. None of these statements cancel each other out. They coexist, uncomfortably, forcing anyone who engages seriously with the castles to think harder than tourism usually demands. This is why honest engagement matters. Not to ruin anyone's vacation, not to impose guilt, not to demand that people stop appreciating architecture or history, but to insist on completeness, on seeing the whole structure, not just the towers reaching toward the sky, but the foundations sunk deep in Welsh soil, built by Welsh hands, designed to hold Wales down forever. The castles succeeded at their purpose for centuries. They failed ultimately because cultures are more resilient than stone, because identity survives occupation, because languages spoken in homes and fields persist when languages written in law books fade. But the success was real while it lasted. The suffering was real. The displacement was real. The legal apartheid was real. These facts don't diminish the architectural achievement. They contextualize it. They make it mean something beyond aesthetic appreciation. Every visitor to these castles faces a choice: what story to accept, what history to internalize, whether to see monuments or crimes, heritage or evidence. The stones themselves are neutral. They'll stand regardless. But the meaning we assign them, the narratives we construct around them, the lessons we draw or refuse to draw, these are active choices. Wales's castles hold up a mirror. What we see reflected depends on whether we're brave enough to look closely, honestly, at what power builds and what that building costs. The reflection is waiting. The question is whether we'll meet its gaze,